Thank you very much for the kind introduction and opportunity to present here. Some people are really passionate in solving the world's biggest problems. I've always been very passionate about discovering principles and turning those principles into simple, practical methods that can help individuals and organizations solve their own biggest problems. Since very early on in my life, I've been curious about a very specific type of situation. I was always very curious about why some people and some organizations could flourish in really challenging circumstances, while most others struggled and even failed. And the basic insight that I gathered was that it is not the starting conditions that matter, that determines whether you will succeed or fail in life, but rather your starting assumptions. You see, every time we make a decision, we make that decision on a set of assumptions. Some of these assumptions are really useful. They enable us sometimes to achieve the impossible. Some assumptions, however, are not so useful. They can even be harmful. A simple example of that is Henry Ford's famous quote of, "Whether you believe you can or can't, you are right." So that's always been my passion, is to try and discover the principles and then these enabling versus limiting assumptions. Dr. Ellie Goldratt wrote an article called "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants," where he talked about the 4 concepts of flow, or the principles of flow. Very simple. Priority number 1 should be improving flow, reducing any losses in flow time or flow rate. Secondly, this objective has to be translated into practical methods. And the one that Dr. Goldratt concentrated on in the article is stopping overproduction. But we need other practical mechanisms as well. And I try to divide them into planning mistakes and principles to prevent those mistakes, execution mistakes, and ongoing improvement. So if we agree that it doesn't matter which system or which part of the system I'm looking at, the goal should be very clear, is how do we meet the committed demand? Not just the average demand that's placed on my department or organization, but the peaks in demand, and how to do it as effectively and efficiently as possible. How do I do that? Because I now have multiple objectives to achieve, and the key insight here is focus just on flow. If I can reduce the flow time, increase the flow rate, my costs will improve, my quality will improve. Everything improves by improving flow. So I have this objective of improving and synchronized flow. I look at the part that's going well, and I look at the part where I'm losing time or capacity. So I looked at planning mistakes. Planning decisions are simply decisions I make before I start to work. So what's the first mistake I can make? Is I can misallocate resources. I can allocate resources long ahead of time based on forecast and then be stuck with the wrong resources in the wrong place. Or I can do local buffers and then end up wasting those buffers. So as a result, I need a practical mechanism that will allow me to dynamically allocate resources based on where it's really needed, and to allocate my buffers in a way that I can aggregate it to protect the whole system. Second mistake I can make in planning is ignoring backlog when I make commitments. I can't quote 30 days lead time if I have a backlog of 60 days, right? I have to consider the backlog when I'm making commitments, and I have to control the release of work into the system to control my WIP and lead times. So as a result, I need a mechanism to quote based on the planned load or backload that's already in there, and to release in a prioritized way while controlling the WIP. Execution decisions are those decisions I make while I'm doing work. And again, the mistakes I can make there is to decide locally what priority I'm going to follow, to multitask, to batch. So again, I need a practical mechanism to provide a single priority system throughout the whole system and discourage batching and multitasking, single piece flow. Do one thing at a time, finish it. The other part in execution is either too much or too little expediting, and dishonest reporting, saying that I'm 80% complete because 80% of the time have passed, rather than thinking about how much work is still remaining. As long as I'm dishonestly reporting, I'm making it impossible for people to judge if we're doing okay or not and knowing what corrective actions to take. So that's an execution, and the last one is the measurement and improvement side. What's the mistakes I can make there is I can measure everything. Every single variance is important, and I'm distracting continuously my top management, paying attention to noise rather than signal. So I need a very practical mechanism of how to know what to measure and what not, and how to differentiate between noise and signal. And then the last one is any local optimization actions resulting in unbalanced demand versus supply. So I need a focusing mechanism that can continuously rebalance supply and demand. So these are the generic principles. What we do is we take those and we convert them into practical applications. Principles are universal. Practices or applications are specific. They are designed to fit certain environments. They have boundary conditions in which they work. So don't argue about lean or TOC, or argue about which one works best within the boundary conditions that I face. I have an example from government quickly to share with you. The basic idea is here, you have a government department that's made up of 10 agencies. Each agency has a budget of 100 million. So in total, a total budget of $1 billion. And the question is, what will happen if more of these agencies experience good years than the ones that experience bad years? And the asymmetry that we modeled is 50% of these agencies will be under budget. So rather than spending the 100, they realize they only need 90. And only 25% of them will go over. Rather than spending 100, they might have spent 110. You'd imagine that that cancels out, right? And it does when you have honest reporting. Over time, you're actually building up a surplus of budget if you have honest reporting. The ones that spent 90 actually declared it. And the ones that spent 110 declared it, but of course they could use some of the buffer that was made available by the others. Look at what happens when there's this unverbalized policy called spend it or lose it. Any of you have heard of that? Right? Federal statistics in America, average expenditure by week for federal government, about $30 to $40 billion a week. Guess what it is in week 52? $130 billion. Right? That's an asymmetrical response, but against you. And this is what happens when you have spend it or lose it. It doesn't matter if you have more good years than bad years, you will keep on building up a deficit. And this is probably at least part of the explanation why the US economy, despite having many more good economic years than bad ones, keep on building up a deficit. So what I proposed here was a very simple alternative rule. I call it save it and share it. You've saved 10 million. Why don't you keep half of that and you spend it on your most highest priority program across line items, whichever you think is the highest priority, and the other 50% you give back to the Treasury to invest on those programs that were underfunded. And suddenly you can see I'm sitting now with a situation where they cancel out and I can even build up a surplus over time. Thank you very much.